Hi, Karin. So nice to have you here, and this is one of our first episodes. So let's start with maybe a quick introduction about yourselves. What do you do? What's your career like?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's really nice to be here. Quick introduction. So my name is Karin. I have several hats. So on one hand, I have been since about 10 plus years one of the partners and directors at Chemistry, which is a strategic design consultancy. So we do multidisciplinary design, work with clients both in the public and private sector. On one hand, human-centered design, but increasingly looking at sustainability questions, moving more from human-centered to planet-centric. And
that's interesting.
We can definitely dive into what that means a little bit later. So that's one side of my career and my life.
Yeah.
The other hat, which is fairly new, is that I also teach now at NUS. I'm a senior lecturer at the Division of Industrial Design. And there I have the great opportunity to actually start a new master program. So we just are in the middle of our first cohort, a master for integrated design. So that's also bringing different disciplines together and looking at how we can bring designers to the next level of their practice and prepare them for the increasingly complex challenges that we're facing.
That's very true. Yeah, things are changing at a fast pace. They are becoming much more convoluted, much more complex. So then service design, which was always misunderstood, it's still, I think, becoming more and more complex. What's service design for you?
So maybe one thing to share in the beginning, I completely understand and agree that it's important to have clear terms. But I think we designers specifically have a preference for having new titles and names for everything. Yes. So service design, maybe very simply put, is about designing experiences, designing processes, and doing that in a way that you look at one hand at the efficiency, how something actually makes sense from a process, from a business point of view, but also very importantly at the desirability. So what actually makes it a seamless and depending on the context, desirable, less painful experience for the end user, but also what happens in the back. So service design, simply put, is really what strings together many of the interactions, many of the products that we use in a daily life. So when I say I'm not so happy or keen or a big fan of all these different terms, because it can very often make things more complicated than they are.
It does, yeah.
But for me, service design is actually very much at the heart of what I have been doing in Chemistry, because as I mentioned, we are multidisciplinary, so we have various kind of designers. We have product designers, we have communication designers, spatial designers, etc., and digital designers. And in order to, for example, work with a public service client and looking at a public service delivery, many of those things come together. So how does the app look that I use to submit my taxes? How does the service center look that I actually go to have an inquiry, etc.? But then service design is the thing that really strings it all together. Okay. How can all the different touch points be coming together in a very seamless way?
All right, almost like an orchestrator. And you mentioned two things, right? Efficiency and desirability. And then just a while back, you were mentioning about planet-centric design. Yeah. So how does service design meet planet-centricism?
So maybe just a quick step back, what I mean with planet-centric design. So I think something that has been around for now several decades, and I believe for most companies, for most people, makes naturally a lot of sense, is the idea that design has to be human-centered.
Yes.
Meaning that when we design something, we need to be aware of the people that we design for, that we design with. What are the needs, what are the challenges? And I think that's something that still has to stand true. We want to be aware who we're actually serving. But I think increasingly we also have to be very conscious about the wider ecosystem that we design within, meaning what are the impacts of to the planet that we all live on. True. So in terms of when we create a product, what are the materials that we actually use? What's the supply chain that's involved? What is happening to the product during use? What's happening to the product after use? So all that is something that we have to be very conscious of. And this expanded mindset can be simply put called planet-centric design.
Okay.
Something it's also called life-centered design, or whatever terminology you want to use. And service design is actually, to me, one of the critical skills that are important to bring this to life.
Yeah, true.
Back to the example of a product. Let me say, I design a product like your cup that, for example, might use materials that are recycled or that are less harmful or hopefully not harmful at all to the environment. If I want to make sure this is truly sustainable product, a planet-centric product, I'm not only thinking about what's happening before the product has been designed and produced, but also thinking what happens afterwards.
True.
And for example, if this now would be a cup that you can, after you don't need it anymore, bring back and it's being reused or resold, between your use and the new users, that's a service. How do you bring it back to the producer? How do they then wash it or bring it to another resale platform, etc.? All those are actually service interactions. So service design is actually a key gel that brings all the things to life.
That's super interesting, because in my early conversations, I feel like service design has always been taken as, all right, you have a customer complaint, you service to that customer, and that becomes kind of like customer service, and people then extend it to customer service design. But what you're saying is it's much bigger. It's also looking at supply chain. It's looking at operations. It's looking at end of life. Many of people who love even iPhones, for example, they don't know what happens to iPhones when they die, a natural death. So those are interesting. So planet-centric, super interesting. Do you think then service design is also evolving? What's happening in service design according to your observations?
I think what is interesting about service design is that it's becoming something that is more and more known, that is more something that people are aware of. On one hand, practitioners. So back to my master's, service design is definitely, for example, a skill that for my students is very high on the list of skills that they see as relevant and critical for them to acquire.
Okay.
Their backgrounds are diverse, from product design to architects, urban planners, etc. So they have all design backgrounds, but from different areas. But all of them are actually quite interested in service design.
Yeah.
Again, because they see that it's actually quite an important, almost facilitator, you mentioned conductor role, to bringing different aspects together.
Yeah.
So on one hand, you can see it's becoming a lot more well-known in the practice.
Yeah.
And I think on the reverse, it also is increasingly well-known and understood in organizations.
Okay.
Of course, this depends a little bit on the maturity of the organization, on the design maturity of the organization. If someone has no designers at all in their team, or only designers that take care of the marketing, then service design might not be really something that they're already thinking of, or only in the context of a service center, customer service center.
Yeah.
But I definitely see an increase in service design maturity and design maturity, which then also means that now the real challenge is, how can you ensure that the different design roles are working well together and the designers working with the rest organization well together in order to actually bring those better services, better products to life.
That's interesting, and it's also relevant to one of the questions you were about to ask, which is, then how do organizations become more service-centric? What should they do?
I think fundamentally it's about thinking, first of all, what are the things that we want to be good at? What are the things that we want to serve deliver to our clients? But also how does our revenue stream, our business model work?
Yeah.
So there's, and maybe I can touch about later, but on the circular business model, so the kind of like changes of that a more planet-centric view on design or business can bring. But fundamentally, for the organization to be more mature in design, and maybe not just looking at service design on its own, but a broader center, higher design maturity, has to do around looking at design in a more broader way. So it's not just about making things look nice or function better, but also looking at the way that designers think or approach problems that can actually be very helpful in a wider set of an organization. So for example, when we look at back to the your example, after you get a call, a customer complaint, how do we deal with that? Is it just like very reactive, we fix this one thing? Or are we actually looking, okay, is this actually a very often occurrence? Is it something that we hear as a signal that is really relevant? Where is this complaint coming from? What is the root cause? And then how can we change certain things around the service delivery, the process? Are all the steps in the process actually relevant? Can we improve the touch point, meaning the app, the website, the store experience, whatever it might be? And that, of course, very quickly cascades out from just the design problem potentially to actually a problem or like a challenge around the process, the system, etc. So maturity has a lot to do with integrating design in all business units or like a wider set of departments of an organization. And that means creating awareness, providing training to designers and non-designers, and enabling collaboration, that people can actually work together.
Yeah. And you used very interesting term called signals, right? So many times when a customer is calling, that's a signal of something else being wrong.
Yes.
Right? So rather than being reactive and saying, all right, sorry, I'll fix it, you should rather be seeing what's the real origin of the problem is.
Yeah.
And yeah, super interesting. So what you're also saying is that every department needs to take the ownership of service design in a way. If not, you are hiring a service designer, maybe you should have those skills of a service designer. I think you were harping onto collaboration as a one key skill too, right?
Definitely collaboration, and definitely just not everyone has to turn into designer, but having a base understanding of what designers can actually do and deliver to a team. There's still, of course, also the high relevance of actually having design skills for designers. So I definitely do believe that service designers, in order to be effective in their role, have to have a minimum of design skills, being able to visualize stuff, being able to bring things to life. But on the reverse, I think it's also important for people working with service designers to have an understanding of the process, have an understanding of the intention and of the benefit of service design in order to better collaborate together. And of course, this goes both ways. It's generally, as a designer, one of the key roles of us is to be empathetic, not just to the end user, but also to understand who we're working with. What are their agendas? What are their KPIs? What are their roles? And how can we best collaborate in order to achieve the bigger goal, whatever that might be.
Sure. And that gets me curious also, because although we are saying service design is kind of responsibility of every department, but the way organizations are structured, there's a CFO looking at finance, there's a CEO looking at numbers and revenue targets, the CTO looking at technology. Where does service design fit into all of the structures?
So I have for all my life worked very much as an external design consultant. So I was been always looking in. And I think that is very often also a way how companies procure service design. They might have like a transformation team or an innovation team, and those are kind of like the ones reaching out and bringing service designers or design strategic designers in. But very often you see, and that of course depends a bit on the organization, service designers having, in large organization, a standalone department, maybe being part of the CX team, the customer experience team, being part of the user experience team or the consumer-facing team. So it depends a little bit. I think here what I've seen very often, it actually depends that it's not just one person having the job to bring service design to the whole organization, but actually having a team that can work together and can support each other.
All right. Yeah, that's a very useful information nugget for, I'm sure, our viewers too. Let's then talk about the most interesting project which you might have done around service design. What comes to your mind?
So one project that is maybe 1 or 2 years ago that I can maybe share a little bit about was for a local telco. And it was interesting because it also showed that service design doesn't necessarily have to be digital, because often the assumption is that service design, we're talking about digital services, and it's the app and the other digital touch points. But service design is really, how does a certain process or experience map out? So in this case, we actually looked at the onboarding experience. So it was also an internal experience. It was about new employees. So we looked specifically, and that's also important in service design to be very clear, like what's the kind of system you're looking at. We looked at a moment when you actually signed a contract to about whatever 2-3 months into your job. What is the experience? And this was very much triggered by internal complaints as well, like about things not working so well, etc. So taking all those signals, all those insights of the data points, and understanding first what are actually the different steps in this journey, what is currently happening, and that is a mix of digital things, this is a mix of actual physical interactions, this is phone calls, emails, etc. So capturing all these different touch points, what was really interesting was to see, okay, who are all the departments involved in this process. And as you say, that ranges from the HR department, who of course is part of the hiring, to the department that then is in charge of actually taking that person on, which can be from all over the organization. But of course also the IT department is involved. It will give you your laptop, etc. So what made this project really interesting but also complicated was to first understand what are the roles of all these different teams involved, what's the actual experience that we want to create, and and what are the barriers that just exist currently? And often those things are not barriers because someone wants to do things in a bad way, but just because there is a lack of communication, a lack of alignment, or just a lot of legacy issues. We have always done it this way, so that's why we continue to do it. So it was really interesting to see, because there was a mix of some very quick fixes and early wins, because it was just like unlocking certain communication issues, to more long-term ideas. Okay, this is something we can't implement immediately, but at a timeline of 2-3 years, there's a good chance we can fix this.
Yeah, I think it gives you a roadmap of what's possible. And how you began the example was very interesting. Many people, the moment they think about innovations and service design, they start thinking about applications. And now it's Gen AI, they think, I'll put my problem in Gen AI and it will give me solutions. But more often than not, it's something much bigger. And onboarding experience is interesting because we also try to then discover from the new employee's point of view what's happening. And in one of my earlier scenarios, I found out that security guards also play an important role, because sometimes you're the first person who is interacting with the new employee, and you're like, I don't know this person, and you're like suddenly like, all right, that's the break-in journey, right? You're the first person of the company meeting this, and you have no idea who the employee joining is, right?
And I think that's another interesting point that applies time and time again, to really understand what's the service experience from in this case, the new employee's point of view, and what's the experience from the HR department, the team that you join, or the security guard. And those will be very, very different experiences.
Absolutely.
So making sense of all of them and see how can we actually make this connection is what makes this job so interesting, but also difficult.
Yeah, it cuts across, and it's becoming more and more important and pertinent of the times. Great. And again, I think going back to you talking about sustainability when we began, so any example of service design when it comes to sustainability itself? How can service design help the world become much better?
I'm not sure if I have an example that saves the world, but I have one example that I am personally very proud of and I got very excited with. So we have been working with a local fashion label called Jinli. They have been working with us on a few projects, including one was joining me at Chemistry for a circular design sprint, where we had like a 5-week program telling them or sharing key principles about the circular economy, key design principles, key business models, all with the intention to help businesses like Jinli to rethink their business. And I mean, Jinli has always been, it's a husband and wife team. They have always been champions of slow fashion. They always had like very much the inspiration to use materials that are less harmful or not harmful, had already like a made-to-order scheme. So their intention was already very much in line with sustainable design. So in many ways, it was very easy to work with them on that theme. And what was great to see is that as a direct result from our interaction with them in the course, in this design sprint, was that they came up with a new service experience in their shop. So as a fashion label, they of course sell their garments, they have collections. I think they have by now 3 different outlets. But their idea was, okay, in order to actually really change our understanding of fashion, in order to change our relationship to garments, and if we want to fight fast fashion, it's also really changing the way that we interact with garments. So what they have developed was basically create your own piece of clothing experience. So you can bring your old t-shirt, and in a workshop you can turn this t-shirt into a bag. They also have a whole collection that they created new, which is basically using offcut from some of their collections. And there's some simple templates that they use, but again, with the experience of customizing it yourself as a user or as a customer, you bring in this service element, that it's not just like I just go there and buy it, but I actually have the experience that I created myself, that changes the relationship that you have with the product. And that can extend the life cycle. It changes how you take care of it. And another thing that they have extended to do is to actually provide repair services. So if there is an issue with a garment, you can bring it back and repair it. So what I mentioned before, service design is very much a way to bring a lot of the more sustainable innovation to life.
Yeah, and I think in this example, it's interesting because they have almost created a differentiator in the market, right? Very few fashion labels are like that, especially in Singapore. and they might stand up in the market, right? Stand out in the market.
Exactly. And maybe that also points to one of the things, back to like the maturity and what companies can do. In some ways, it is, I'm not saying it's easy for them. It's also, of course, difficult to like change your business model,
Yes.
etc. But they are a small organization. They very much work as a startup. So they can be very agile. And they
Yeah.
are very, very much embracing of this iterative mindset. And they're both designers. So I think that also helps. It can be a lot more difficult for a large organization to go for transformations like that.
Okay.
So that, of course, is also one of the challenges of becoming more mature with design or implementing service design.
It's the agile way in which you can move forward and
Yeah.
take feedback from customers.
Exactly.
And what I also love about this example was the way consumers are investing themselves in creating the product, right? And that's part of the
Exactly.
service journey.
Exactly, yes.
Oh, awesome. Wonderful. And I'll definitely check out this fashion label. So switching gears, I think when I moved to Asia, I worked for some time in Hong Kong, then in Singapore for the last few years. And I observed that there are some differences between how the West sees service design and how Asia sees service design. Many times, Asian companies look at the West to see what's happening there. But if you are a Western company, is there something to learn from the Asian companies when it comes to service design?
Well, actually, we are a Singapore company. Just interesting thing, we did the other way around. We started in Singapore almost over 20 years ago, and then opened up in the Netherlands. But you're right that very often the kind of inspiration seems to go the other way around, that we look to the West and see what they're doing and try to bring it over here. I do feel, though, that especially when it comes to service design, and here in Singapore specifically, that there's actually a lot of great examples in the public service sector. That I think and Europe, of course, is not homogeneous. There's lots of different countries that have like different experiences. But I'm from Austria, so I can definitely talk about the public service about Austria. And that's something that has been a lot slower in becoming digitized and more seamless than here in Singapore.
Yeah.
Picking up, but I think what we have here in Singapore, for example, with the SingPass, and the fact that you, since several years now, can basically conduct all your public services online, is something that is really outstanding, and I think a lot of countries can learn from Singapore.
All right. Yeah, that's a very, very good example. As in a conference a few days back, and they were saying maybe because of these service design implementations, the trust in government and public services is one of the highest in Singapore. If I remember the numbers correctly, they were saying more than 70 or 80% of citizens in Singapore trust the government to make the right decisions for them, right? So for governments, it's super essential, right? And so that's why maybe we need to look at how Asian countries, especially maybe Singapore, has done this. One application cutting across all, and made a difference there. That's wonderful. So again, switching the gears here, we are observing many trends, people behavior changing, cultures changing. There's a lot more globalization. Technologies have come into play. How is the new trend in technologies like AI and other things impacting service design? Do you see any impact on service design? How is it changing it for good or for bad? What are your observations?
I think there's definitely, in general design practice, AI has a big impact in terms of just supporting the way that we work. I think it will be hard pressed to find someone who's not using one or another AI tool to help their work stream, from helping you make sense of research, gathering data, creating visuals, etc. So I think that is very clear that in the day-to-day practice of design, AI is very important as a tool. I would still say, though, that I still see it much as an assistant, a tool that I work with that makes my life easier, but not necessarily something that would replace having a team, for example, other designers, other stakeholders that I can engage with. So it's an assistant, but it's not a replacement. In the actual service delivery, I think there's definitely also a space for AI, a very important space. But again, here, what I do see, and it's not the first time, that it's also still very much a hype, a big trend, where there's like not a demand that, we just need to add an AI feature in here because that's the thing to do, and somewhat detached from the fact, do we even need it? A few years ago, it was blockchain. Before that, everyone needed an app just out of principle. So that will go away, I hope. And then the question really comes down to, as always with any technological innovation, using tech for a purpose and not just because we can.
Yeah, a tech for purpose. So where do you foresee the biggest impact of AI for service design, let's say?
From a practitioner's point of view, I think it can actually be very helpful in streamlining our storytelling, because I think storytelling, data collection as well, I can maybe go back to that later as well, but I think storytelling is actually very, very important, and that means, for example, good writing, copywriting, may that be for your service blueprint, your presentation, or the actual then interfaces and touch points.
Yes.
But also creating visuals. I think that's something that can definitely be very helpful and very impactful, because services in themselves are intangible.
Yes.
It's very hard to actually bring to life what it is that you're designing here. So having really strong narratives, for example, in a presentation to stakeholders, or having really strong assets like a storyboard or a service blueprint that brings to life the journey that you're designing, the service that you're designing, is really critical.
Yeah.
And I think here the various AI tools can be very powerful in supporting the designer.
Yeah. And that's something I have observed too, because we interact with many students and these are all executives. And I realize that storytelling is very hard for a normal person who has never drawn or sketched.
Yeah.
And the whole art of storytelling is very, very tough to even learn, right? But with these AI tools, at least it becomes like you're using the word assistant. It becomes your story writing assistant.
Yeah.
Taking the example of employee onboarding, all right, you've done your research, you found out how the employee's journey looks like. If you're presenting and it's a big Word document, it's again failing, right?
Yeah.
No one is going to read through it. But the moment you put it visually as a storyboard using some of these AI tools to bring it to life, oh my God, I've seen the change in the stakeholders' mindset the moment they see these videos or artifacts. So big change in empathizing then with the stories.
Absolutely. I think that's really one of the key things that a service designer has to do. Yes, the research and the making sense of it and crafting a new journey, but then also sharing it and getting the buy-in from the stakeholders of like, what exactly is this new experience that we're going for, the new service, and what impact it will create.
Yeah, absolutely. Talking about trends, I think the other thing which I've also seen is customers' expectations are also changing, right? Now we are becoming, we want it now, right?
Yes.
The now generation probably. So what's the impact of these customer behavior changes on service design? Have you observed any of these?
I think that's one of the interesting things, and that's actually not something that's so recent, but I think in Singapore, I have seen that for a few years now, and it's just not getting any less, is that maybe also a reason why government just has to have very high-class services, is that here the expectation from any government service is the same to a corporate player.
Yeah.
So I want my app for my paying my taxes and the app for any other touch point for a government service, HDB or ICA, to be as seamless as me talking to my bank or ordering food. So I think that's something that we've seen increasingly, that people see it on par.
Yeah.
Like, why can't I customize whatever I'm doing with the government as much as I can customize my online order?
Yeah, absolutely. Now they're comparing the same expectations as a corporate player or private company player to a government one. Yeah, interesting.
Me picking up my passport and me getting a Amazon Prime delivery.
Now,
exactly.
All right. Yeah, that's very, very interesting and super helpful. We are almost towards the end of our podcast. I wanted to ask you maybe 5 or 6 last questions. These are kind of quick, top of your mind. So whatever comes to your mind, you can let me know. The first one book which is a must-read for any service designer.
That's a very difficult question, because there's so many great books. I might take it a little bit in a different direction. It's not necessarily a service design book per se.
Yeah.
It's a book on regenerative design. It's called Flourish. The reason why I also think it's a great book to shout out, because it's generally like providing great guidance and principles for a more planet-centric or regenerative way of designing. And from the two authors, so one is Michael Palin, and the other one, Sarah Ishioka, is actually based in Singapore. And I think it's also very important that we read more books of local designers and local authors. So Flourish, is definitely highly on my list.
Awesome. And that's now onto my list too. Second one, what comes to your mind when you think about great service design? Any company, product, or service itself?
It might be not so surprising, but that's my go-to, and I still stick with it. Changi Airport.
Wow.
Changi Airport, because it's just very interesting how such a large and complex operation, where also a lot of different stakeholders are involved, manages over years to operate so seamless and so smooth. And you have the comparison to so many other airports in the region, but also globally. And it's just every time a very different service experience coming home.
Yeah, and like they say, the best service is almost like magic, right? So it feels like a magical place.
From getting out of the plane to actually being in front of your Grab in 20 minutes, it feels like magic.
Absolutely. Question number 3. One skill that is a must-have or most important for any service designer?
I think that's what we talked about before. I think it's the storytelling, is being able to actually bring a service to life that often can be very intangible and tell the story of what the new service experience will do, no matter if it's digital, if it's physical, it's a process experience. I think that is very important.
All right. Oh, great one. Question 4. One prediction for service design?
It will increase in importance, and hopefully the understanding that services are the connection of many of the products that we use every day is something that's going to move out of the design domain and into many other roles as well.
Oh, great answer. Question 5, your go-to tool for any service design?
Miro.
Absolutely, so is mine. And the last one, if you had a chance to redesign any public service in Singapore, which one will it be?
The public service is a difficult one because they actually are really good. So I'm a little bit stumped on that one. I think the one thing is not really a public service, but one thing that I'm struggling with is actually the buses in Singapore.
Okay.
Because the inside and the outside, it's really hard to see which number you're in. When you're inside the bus, there's no announcement on the next station, or most of them. They don't tell you which number you're on, and on the outside, it's the numbers only in the front and in the back. So that might be a small thing, but as a designer, it's a bugbear because that would be a very easy fix.
All right, and I'm sure we have someone from LTA who's looking at this. So an improvement or a feedback from one of the users. Thank you so much, Karin. This conversation has been wonderful, very insightful for me as well as I'm sure for the audiences. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me. This was fun.
Same for me. I hope you liked the podcast. In case you have any suggestions, comments, or feedback, do let us know. If you have any suggestions for speakers for our future podcast, do send in those suggestions as well. And if you're curious how to become a service designer or a UX designer, then do check out the courses which we have on offer at NUS-ISS. See you for the next podcast.